It's a real privilege and a great honor for Hilda and me to be here because Jackson was one of my great heroes, and indeed he was the hero of every one of the 100 American lawyers in Nuremberg who participated in the 12 subsequent trials following the big trial that Jackson was prosecutor in. The great effectiveness that Robert H. Jackson had in that case, he was just superb, and I think his contribution to the development of the Nuremberg Trials was just incalculable. He was magnificent. I went over as General Taylor's legal assistant, and of course, as soon as I got there, I received assignments from Telford Taylor and involving drafting of the indictments and collecting evidence, and I traveled with General Taylor, Hilda and I did, all over Europe collecting evidence and talking to prospective witnesses in a good many of the capitals of Europe.
As you were preparing for the trials, did you know you were going to have the two trials that you were participating in, the doctor's trial and the Oswald Pohl trial?
No, that developed as time went on. I was involved early on in, as I said, the preparation of a good many of the trials. In fact, I worked on almost all of the 12 cases at one time or another as General Taylor's assistant.
Here were Hauser going to divide, have this division of labor, or did he kind of take you under the wing and say, Jack, I want you to do X, Y, and Z?
It was more the latter. Yeah. My office was in his outer office, and so I worked with him very closely day by day.
Okay.
Asked permission from the, I guess, the military government at the time to take the pre-trial deposition of Hermann Goering, and that was granted. And so I spent about an hour taking his deposition, and this was a few days before the sentencing by the military tribunal. He was a cooperative witness, I might say, but he was also a very arrogant person. He
describe him. What did he look like?
Well, he had lost a lot of weight. I think when he was captured, he weighed around 300 pounds, and he was down to 162 pounds in his military uniform without insignia, hung on him like a gunny sack. When he entered the chamber, he clicked his heels and saluted, and he assumed that he was in complete charge of the interrogation.
Did you tell him in advance the areas you wanted to talk about?
Yes, and he freely admitted his complicity in the use of slave labor in the concentration camps, but he denied any knowledge of the atrocious conditions in the concentration camp. His testimony, I don't think, was of any particular value to us in the Pohl case. The fourth case was the Pohl case, and General Taylor asked me to be the chief prosecutor in that case.
Did you also get a chance to interview Oswald Pohl?
Yes, and of course I cross-examined him at the trial, and a good many of the other 18 defendants.
Military Tribunal 1.
Worked on the indictment. I helped collect the evidence. I interviewed a good many of the witnesses who had been concentration camp inmates. I presented evidence at the trial. I think both in direct evidence and cross-examination of defendants. Hitler's immediate subordinate and in charge of medical services throughout Germany.
What was your impression of him?
He was a very competent doctor, a very arrogant man. He was completely dedicated to Hitler and to the Nazi philosophy.
And he was, what was his relationship to Mengele?
I have to tell you, I can't remember. Mengele, of course, was not brought to trial in Nuremberg because he hadn't been apprehended at the time, and I don't recall the relationship. Mengele was in one of the concentration camps and would have been under Brandt's supervision and would have been under the auspices of the officers in the Pole case also. Well, I think that, for example, and there were many such examples, the poison bullets that were used to shoot inmates to see how quickly the inmate would die, and then the freezing experiments were horrendous also. Concentration camp inmates were dunked in freezing water and left outside in sub-zero temperatures for hours, and many died from that kind of an experimentation. But all of the experiments that were conducted in the concentration camps were really horrendous. The philosophy behind the experimentation was not, in general, to develop medical advances. It was to see how effectively methods could be devised to kill and not to cure. The prosecution cannot take credit for having introduced as the Nuremberg Code as a proposed findings. There were 10 fundamental principles of medical experimentation that were developed and enunciated in the court's opinion in the doctor's the medical experimentation case. Severity of the sentences declined. All of the death sentences occurred in 3 cases that were tried early on, namely the medical case, the Pole case, and the Einsatzgruppen case. But as time went on, the sentences became less and less severe, so that toward the end of the 12 cases, the sentences were greatly mitigated. And I think that was largely because of the Cold War and the perceived need to obtain some of the expertise that the German people had to be utilized against the Russians.
What is the legacy of the Nuremberg Trials?
I think the primary legacy is the establishment of the principle that of criminal responsibility for even the heads of state. And the trials themselves are international trials. They were international criminal trials, and I think that is the legacy of Nuremberg.